the complexity of the ethical challenges that are behind every single one of the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the lessons, one of the things we can draw from discussions like today and from the engagement with religious leaders is that they bring the ethical questions much more clearly to the fore with a whole set of tools to look at them. So I think that's a first set of questions, is this religious, non-religious divide, accentuated by blindness and by indifference. A second point that came out in a number of ways during the discussions at this conference, but which is also very much a part of the overall, the backdrop for these discussions, is that religion or religious institutions or religious behavior, let's say, is part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution. It's what Cole Durham actually referred to in his opening comments by recalling the ambivalence of the sacred. I, as I said, had worked in the World Bank for some time, and I was always struck by how many people used religious analogies to discuss the worst aspects of our behavior, which was that we preach, we didn't listen, we had immovable beliefs in unseen forces, in this case the hidden hand of the market, and various other unattractive qualities. But I think that that is part of the, first of all, it's the negative stereotypes about religion, but it is also some of the realities of negatives. But we should never forget the positives of the gifts that religious traditions and beliefs bring. And it starts with something that wasn't mentioned here very much today, which I think is joy, which is the immense pleasure that people get, the understanding, the bonds of community, not to speak of the deep traditions of care for education and health. It is striking that we in the United States are, I assure you, involved in a very deep soul searching right now about what has happened to our country and what is going to happen with the surprise, the shock that came with the recent election. And clearly thinking about the roles of religious beliefs in that is one of the priorities, and trying to understand what the relationship is. Third set of issues, we're speaking about it quite often, and I think in many ways this conference is part of this journey, is what we can call religious literacy. We're dealing in many societies, particularly Europe and the United States, I don't know how far you would make this comment about India, with a generation which has largely been raised without any systematic education about the religious composition overall. And there is a book by a guy called Stephen Prothero, which basically documents that even people know very little, people know even very little about their own faith tradition. So Noah's flood, Jacob's coat, things that were part of the basic understanding of societies in the past are something that's completely absent today. So they come into professions, whether it's the Foreign Service or development work or law or medicine, with almost no understanding of what religious traditions are about. And so the question is, what do you do to remedy that? What is religious literacy? What are the standards that you expect? Because another feature of dealing with religion is, as someone commented, it's a bit like brain surgery, that it may be absolutely essential, but if it's done badly, it can be absolutely fatal. And therefore, the question of exactly what kinds of knowledge, what level of understanding, standards one expects, and how one would deliver that to different communities is a vital issue in parts of the international community. As I said, particularly Europe and the United States, but I suspect it would apply in many other regions as well. The fourth issue is, how do you organize religious engagement, with the obvious proviso that this will differ in every country. But a standards comment to this effect is that if you're not at the table, you end up on the menu. In other words, if people are not engaged in policy discussions, if they're not asked, if their views are not sought and taken into account, if they're not familiar with what the discourse is about, their concerns will not be central to the solution. So the question then becomes which tables, who should be at them, and there clearly are some questions. One that's an obvious one is that if you look to religious communities, standard religious hierarchies, you're going to have mostly older men and almost no women and almost no younger people. So there needs to be a much more purposeful effort than has often been the case to ensure against something that is known in the United States as manels. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a manel. That's an all-male panel. And so we're trying to ensure that these groups are represented. And one obvious but complicated solution to that is to look for interfaith solutions, which first of all can break through some patterns and traditions, and secondly can assure a much more plural, much more diverse representation in whichever table you're talking about, whether it's a national economic strategy or a social welfare policy or whatever. And the fifth, I think that we should keep coming back to what is at the center of these sustainable development goals and the search for peace, which is addressing the problems of poverty and the very closely related issues of governance. And both of those, I think, are at the center of our purpose together in what we're trying to accomplish. And I think we need to ask much more clearly what is poverty. I'm often struck that you can be in a setting, in fact, I heard it today, where some people will say with complete conviction that poverty is getting worse, and others will say with complete conviction that we've never made so much progress in ending poverty in the whole of human history as we have within the past decade and a half. And these are, to some extent, contradictory, and they reflect differing perceptions, but also different definitions. One of the keys, The Economist magazine this week actually focuses on failing states and draws very much on a book by Asimoglu and Robinson called Why Nations Fail. And their answer is elite behavior. Whether elites are inclusive or exclusive is what makes the difference between countries that succeed and those that don't. I think there are three other issues that I would highlight. One is gender, the enormous importance of dealing with gender issues. And in discussion after discussion about religion, issues of the relationships between boys and girls and men and women keeps coming back as a centerpiece which should never be forgotten. A second issue is justice for the poor. Gary Haugen has given many lectures and speeches and written lectures that basically argue that the vast majority of the world's poor have no access to justice of any formal kind. And they have a violence which he describes as a locust attack. And the lack of justice and law and order for the world's poor is a central point that has had little focus but should have much more. And finally, in this dizzying acceleration of change that we're all living